There is a question that sits underneath almost all of human history, and for a very long time almost nobody was allowed to ask it honestly. Why did some societies end up with guns, steel swords, ocean-going ships, written language, and centralized empires, while other societies, often living in the exact same century, were still using stone tools and small kinship bands? Why did European ships arrive on the shores of Africa, the Americas, and Australia, carrying conquest, disease, and domination instead of the other way around? Why didn't Incan ships arrive in Spain first? Why didn't Zulu armies cross the ocean and colonize England? For most of the 20th century, the only socially acceptable answers to this question were quietly, and sometimes not so quietly, racist. The unspoken assumption, baked into school textbooks, museum exhibits, and casual dinner table conversation, was that European societies advanced faster because Europeans were somehow smarter, more inventive, more disciplined, more civilized by nature. Some version of this idea had been used for centuries to justify colonization, slavery, and the violent rearrangement of entire continents. It was the kind of explanation that flattered the people telling it and degraded everyone else, and because it flattered the tellers, it survived far longer than it should have, hiding inside textbooks that never used the word race directly but implied a hierarchy of human capability anyway. In 1997, a scientist named Jared Diamond published a book that tried to answer this same enormous historical question, but with a radically different premise. Diamond was not a historian by training. He was a physiologist and evolutionary biologist who had spent decades doing fieldwork in Papua New Guinea, studying birds, and along the way becoming close friends with the people of New Guinea, whose society's Western anthropology had often quietly categorized as primitive. The book that emerged from those decades of work was called Guns, Germs, and Steel: The Fates of Human Societies, and its argument was this: the vast inequalities in power and technology that have shaped the modern world were not caused by differences in human intelligence or virtue between peoples. They were caused by differences in geography, environment, and the accidents of which plants and animals happened to be available for domestication on different continents thousands of years before recorded history even began. In other words, the entire shape of the modern world, who colonized whom, who got conquered, whose languages spread across continents, was set in motion not by the genius or inferiority of particular peoples, but by dumb geographic luck stretching back to the end of the last ice age. This was an explosive claim in 1997, and it remains a contested one today. The book won the Pulitzer Prize. It became a bestseller translated into dozens of languages. It was turned into a National Geographic documentary series. It became one of the most assigned books in university courses on history, geography, anthropology, and economics. And it also became, almost immediately, one of the most fiercely debated books in those same fields, with serious scholars accusing Diamond of oversimplifying staggeringly complex histories into a tidy geographic formula, of underweighting the role of human agency, culture, and choice, of writing what some critics called a kind of geographic determinism that, however well-intentioned, flattened real people in real societies into passive products of their environment. So in this video, we are going to walk through Diamond's actual argument carefully, step by step, the way he builds it across the book. We are going to understand exactly what evidence he marshals, why he starts with a deceptively simple question asked to him by a New Guinean man named Yali, and how that single question becomes the engine for an entire theory of world history. We are also going to look honestly at where this theory has been challenged, where it holds up well under scrutiny, and where serious historians and anthropologists have found real problems with it. This is not going to be an uncritical celebration of the book, nor a dismissal of it. It is going to be an honest walk through one of the most ambitious attempts in modern intellectual history to answer a question that for centuries had mostly been answered with prejudice dressed up as common sense. If you have ever wondered why the map of the world looks the way it does, why certain regions became centres of empire, while others became the targets of conquest, why some societies developed writing and metallurgy thousands of years before others, this video is going to give you a framework for thinking about that question that has nothing to do with which peoples are smarter or more capable, and everything to do with seeds, soil, latitude, and the unpredictable luck of which animals happen to be standing nearby when human beings first started experimenting with farming. Let's begin with the question that started it all, asked on a beach in Papua New Guinea in 1972 by a local politician named Yali, to a young American scientist who had no idea at the time that he would spend the next 25 years trying to give a real answer. In 1972, Jared Diamond was walking along a beach in Papua New Guinea with a man named Yali, a local political leader who was intelligent, charismatic, and deeply curious about the wider world beyond his island. Yali had spent time around European colonial administrators, missionaries, and visiting scientists like Diamond, and he had noticed something that any observant person in his position would have noticed. The Europeans who arrived in New Guinea brought with them an enormous quantity of manufactured goods: steel axes, matches, umbrellas, medicine, radios, clothing, all of which the New Guineans called, in the pidgin English of the region, cargo. Yali had also noticed that despite generations of contact, despite colonial administration, despite missionary schools, New Guineans themselves had not developed any of this cargo on their own. They had remained, materially speaking, in roughly the same technological position, while waves of outsiders arrived bearing increasingly sophisticated tools. So Yali asked Diamond a question that was simple to state and almost impossible to answer honestly, without confronting the entire architecture of world history. He asked, why is it that you, white people, developed so much cargo and brought it to New Guinea, but we black people had so little cargo of our own? Diamond later wrote that this question stuck with him for decades, not because the answer was obvious, but because every easy answer available at the time was either false or quietly offensive. The easiest available answer, the one that had circulated implicitly through centuries of European colonial thought, was some version of innate superiority, that Europeans were simply more intelligent, more inventive, biologically or culturally predisposed toward technological progress in a way other peoples were not. Diamond rejected this answer immediately and completely, and he had good personal reasons to reject it. Having spent extended time living and working among New Guineans, he had observed them solving extraordinarily complex practical problems, navigating dense rainforest terrain, managing intricate social and political relationships across dozens of language groups, surviving in environments that would be lethal to an untrained outsider within days. If anything, Diamond noted, the cognitive demands of daily survival in Highland New Guinea seemed in many ways more intellectually taxing than the conveniences of modern industrial life, where machines and institutions handle problems that once required direct human ingenuity to solve. So if the difference wasn't intelligence, what was it? This is the question that became the spine of the entire book. Diamond's answer, developed and refined across hundreds of pages of evidence pulled from archaeology, linguistics, genetics, botany, and zoology, was that the ultimate cause of the cargo gap Yali had identified was not something about the people themselves, but something about the very different starting conditions of the continents those people happened to inhabit. Specifically, Diamond argued that the availability of wild plants and animals suitable for domestication varied enormously from one part of the world to another, and that this single variable decided tens of thousands of years ago by accidents of evolutionary history and geography set off a chain reaction. Domesticable plants and animals led to food surpluses led to population density and settled village life. Settled village life led to specialization of labor, because not everyone needed to spend all day producing food anymore. Specialization led to the development of technology, writing systems, and complex political organization, because some people could now spend their time inventing, administering, and building instead of farming or hunting. And alongside all of this, living in close quarters with domesticated animals exposed these populations to a battery of new infectious diseases, against which, over many generations, they slowly built up partial immunity. This is the famous chain that gives the book its title. Guns represented the technology, the weaponry and tools that flowed from settled, specialized societies. Germs represented the diseases that settled agricultural societies had unintentionally bred and developed partial resistance to, diseases that would later prove devastatingly lethal to populations who had never been exposed to them. And steel represented metallurgy, another downstream product of food surplus, population density, and specialized labor, that gave certain societies a profound material advantage in warfare and tool-making over others. None of this, Diamond insisted again and again throughout the book, had anything to do with the inherent capability of the people involved. It had to do with what nature happened to make available to them, thousands of years before any of them were born, in the specific patch of the earth their ancestors happened to occupy. Yali never got a full answer on that beach in 1972, It took Diamond 25 more years of research to write one. And in the next section, we're going to look at the very first domino in that chain, the astonishingly unequal global distribution of plants and animals that could actually be domesticated in the first place. To understand Howard Diamond's argument, you have to start with a fact that sounds almost too simple to matter, but turns out to be one of the most consequential facts in all of human history. Not all wild plants and animals are equally suited to domestication, and the ones that are suited to it are wildly unevenly distributed across the surface of the earth. This is the foundation the entire rest of the book is built on, and it's worth sitting with carefully, because once you understand it, an enormous amount of subsequent history starts to make a different kind of sense. Consider plants first. For a wild plant species to become a useful domesticated crop, it needs a fairly specific combination of traits. It needs to produce something genuinely nutritious or otherwise useful in significant quantity. It needs to be a plant whose desirable traits, larger seeds, better taste, easier harvesting, can actually be selected for and improved through generations of human cultivation, meaning it needs enough some or natural genetic variability to respond to selective breeding. It helps enormously if the plant is an annual, meaning it completes its life cycle in a single growing season, because that gives early farmers many cycles of trial and selection within a human lifetime rather than waiting decades for a single tree to mature. It helps if the plant can self-pollinate or be easily controlled in its pollination, so that farmers can predict and shape the next generation rather than leaving it to chance. And it helps if the plant doesn't have toxic or bitter wild ancestors that take many generations of careful breeding to neutralize. When Diamond and other researchers catalogue the world's wild grass species, the category that includes wheat, barley, rice and corn among its domesticated descendants, they found something striking. The Fertile Crescent, the region spanning parts of modern-day Iraq, Syria, Turkey and Israel, happened to contain a remarkably dense concentration of wild grasses and legumes that were almost perfectly suited for domestication. Wild wheat, wild barley, lentils, peas, chickpeas, all clustered together in the same general region, all ready to be domesticated by any human population that started deliberately planting and harvesting them. This wasn't because the people living in the Fertile Crescent around 11,000 years ago were unusually clever. It was because the plants happened to already exist there, having evolved those favourable traits through entirely unrelated evolutionary pressures over millions of years, long before any human ever looked at them and thought about farming. Compare this to other regions of the world. Sub-Saharan Africa, despite its enormous biodiversity, contains very few wild grass species with this same convenient cluster of domesticable traits. The available African staples that were eventually domesticated, like sorghum, and African rice, tended to be domesticated thousands of years later than Fertile Crescent crops, and they generally produced less caloric yield per unit of effort. The Americas had an even starker problem. Corn, which eventually became one of the most productive crops in human history, started out as a wild grass called teosinte that bore almost no resemblance to modern corn and required thousands of years of patient selective breeding before it produced ears of a useful size. This delay meant that the American societies took dramatically longer to reach the food surplus thresholds that Fertile Crescent societies reached relatively quickly. New Guinea, Yali's home, had almost no domesticable cereal grains at all. The local agriculture that did develop there centred on crops like taro and bananas, which provided calories but lacked the protein density and storage properties of grains, meaning New Guinean societies developed agriculture independently and impressively, but never generated the same scale of food surplus that grain-based agriculture eventually produced elsewhere. Diamond's point throughout all of this is not that any of these other regions' peoples failed to figure something out. New Guineans, Sub-Saharan Africans, and indigenous Americans all independently invented agriculture, in some cases earlier than parts of Europe ever did. The point is that the raw biological material available to work with in each region differed enormously, and that difference compounded over thousands of years into an enormous gap in food surplus, population density, and eventually technological development. Of the world's hundreds of thousands of wild plant species, only a small handful, concentrated overwhelmingly in just a few regions, turned out to have the rare combination of traits needed for productive domestication, and the Fertile Crescent simply happened to win this geographic lottery in a way that shaped everything that followed. In the next section, we turn to the animal side of this same lottery, and to one of the most quietly devastating arguments in the entire book, the strange and largely irreversible reasons why only a tiny number of large mammal species in the entire history of the world have ever been successfully domesticated. If the uneven distribution of domesticable plants was one half of Diamond's geographic lottery, the uneven distribution of domesticable large mammals was the other half, and in some ways it's the more startling argument in the entire book. Of the roughly 148 species of large, herbivorous, land-dwelling mammals, weighing over 100 pounds that have existed in the world during the period relevant to early human history, only 14 have ever been successfully domesticated by human beings. And of those 14, only a handful, the cow, the sheep, the goat, the pig, and the horse, ever became truly significant to large-scale agricultural societies and warfare. Diamond borrows a phrase from the opening line of Tolstoy's novel Anna Karenina to describe why this number is so small. Tolstoy wrote that happy families are all alike, but every unhappy family is unhappy in its own way, meaning that happiness requires meeting many conditions simultaneously, while unhappiness can come from failing at any single one of them. Diamond applies this same logic to animal domestication. A domesticable animal needs to succeed on every single one of about 6 separate criteria, and failing at just one of them is enough to make domestication essentially impossible. The animal needs an appropriate diet, ideally an efficient herbivore or omnivore that doesn't require enormous quantities of meat or specializes food to raise economically. It needs a relatively fast growth rate, so that it reaches a useful size within a time frame that makes raising it worthwhile, rather than waiting years for a marginal payoff. It needs to be willing to breed in captivity, which sounds obvious, but rules out a surprising number of otherwise promising species. Cheetahs, for example, despite being trainable as individual hunting animals for thousands of years, almost never breed successfully in captivity because of an elaborate, space-demanding courtship ritual that simply cannot happen in a pen. The animal needs a pleasant enough disposition to be safely managed by humans, which immediately rules out many large and otherwise food-efficient animals, like the African buffalo or the grizzly bear, whose temperaments make close human management lethally dangerous. It needs to be resistant to panicking in enclosed spaces, since animals that flee or stampede at the slightest provocation, like gazelles and most deer species, are essentially impossible to fence and herd effectively. And finally, it needs a social structure built around hierarchy and herd-following behavior, since species that naturally follow a dominant leader, like sheep and cattle, can be managed by humans who simply step into the role of that leader, while solitary or non-hierarchical species resist this kind of management entirely. Once you apply this 6-part filter across the entire animal kingdom, the available pool of candidates collapses dramatically, and crucially, the small number of species that pass all 6 tests are concentrated overwhelmingly in Eurasia. The Fertile Crescent and its surrounding regions had access to wild cattle, wild sheep, wild goats, wild pigs, and wild horses, all of which happen to combine the right diet, growth rate, breeding behavior, temperament, and social structure to be domesticated. Sub-Saharan Africa, despite its spectacular abundance of large mammals, the zebra, the African buffalo, the rhinoceros, the elephant, the giraffe, never produced a single major domesticated species from its native large mammal population. Not because African peoples failed to try, but because every single African candidate species failed at least one of the 6 criteria, usually temperament or breeding behavior. The Americas lost most of their large mammal candidates entirely in a wave of extinctions that occurred shortly after humans first arrived there, likely some combination of climate change and human hunting pressure, leaving llamas and alpacas as the only large domesticated mammals native to the entire Western Hemisphere, animals that, while useful, could not be ridden by adult humans or used to pull heavy ploughs in the way horses and oxen could in Eurasia. This had cascading consequences that extended far beyond agriculture. Large domesticated animals provided meat and milk, certainly, but they also provided traction power for ploughing fields far more efficiently than human labour alone, transportation that allowed armies and trade goods to move faster and farther, and crucially, manure that dramatically improved soil fertility for crop agriculture. Societies with access to horses could field cavalry that gave them a decisive military advantage over societies without them, a fact that played out with brutal clarity centuries later when Spanish conquistadors on horseback, despite being vastly outnumbered, repeatedly defeated indigenous American armies who had never encountered a mounted soldier before in their entire history. Diamond's argument here circles back to the same core point as the previous section. None of this had anything to do with which peoples were more intelligent or capable. It had everything to do with which peoples happened to be born onto a continent that contained, by sheer accident of evolutionary history, a workable supply of large mammals meeting an extremely narrow and demanding set of biological criteria. In the next section, we look at what happens once a society does manage to get past this lottery and accumulate food surplus, and how that surplus transforms not just economics, but the entire social and political structure of a civilization. Once a society gains access to productive domesticated plants and animals, something begins to happen that Diamond treats as almost mechanically predictable, even though it plays out differently in every specific historical case. Food surplus is the hinge on which the entire rest of human social and political development turns, and understanding why requires thinking carefully about what life looks like for a population that does not have enough surplus food, compared to one that does. In a hunter-gatherer society, or in an early agricultural society operating close to the subsistence level, virtually every able-bodied person needs to spend the overwhelming majority of their time and energy directly producing or gathering food, simply to keep the group alive. There is very little slack in the system. A bad season, a failed hunt, a poor harvest can mean genuine starvation. Under these conditions, there is almost no capacity for anyone to specialize full-time in something other than food production, because the group cannot afford to support someone who isn't contributing directly to the food supply. This is why hunter-gatherer and subsistence farming societies throughout history have tended to be small, mobile or semi-mobile, and relatively egalitarian in their internal political structure. There simply isn't enough surplus wealth concentrated anywhere to support kings, standing armies, professional priesthoods, or specialized craftsmen producing goods that aren't immediately needed for survival. Now, introduce a productive cereal grain crop, domesticated livestock providing milk, meat and labor, and the agricultural efficiency that comes with both. Suddenly, the same amount of land and labor can produce considerably more food than the immediate population needs to survive. This surplus changes everything downstream. First, it allows population density to increase substantially, because the food supply can now support more people living in the same area. Second, and this is the crucial mechanism Diamond focuses on, it allows some fraction of the population to stop producing food entirely, and instead specialize in other activities, because the food producers are generating enough surplus to feed people who aren't farming themselves. This is the literal origin of occupational specialization as we understand it. Some people become full-time toolmakers, refining technology rather than splitting their attention between toolmaking and farming. Some become soldiers, defending the group's accumulated surplus and territory, rather than producing food themselves. Some become priests or religious officials, administering the increasingly complex symbolic and organizational life of a settled, growing population. Some become administrators and record keepers, managing the practical challenges of governing a larger, denser population than any hunter-gatherer band ever had to coordinate, which is itself one of the major pressures that drove the independent invention of writing systems in multiple early civilizations, since memory alone becomes insufficient once you need to track grain stores, tax obligations, and legal disputes across thousands of people. This specialization compounds on itself in a way that Diamond describes almost like a snowball gaining momentum. Full-time toolmakers innovate faster than part-time ones, because they have more accumulated time and attention to dedicate to the problem, and they can build on the accumulated knowledge of previous specialists rather than starting over each generation. Full-time soldiers, supported by surplus food rather than needing to farm themselves, can train more rigorously and develop more sophisticated military organization and technology. Concentrated populations supported by agricultural surplus also create the population density that allows for the construction of large-scale infrastructure, irrigation systems, fortified cities, and eventually monumental architecture, all of which require a labor force large enough and stable enough to be coordinated over years or decades, something only possible once food production no longer absorbs the labor of nearly the entire population. Diamond also makes the point that increasing population density doesn't just enable specialization, it also creates political pressure for more centralized organization. A small hunter-gatherer band of 20 or 30 people can resolve internal disputes through direct, face-to-face social pressure, because everyone knows everyone else personally. A settled agricultural society of thousands or tens of thousands of people cannot function this way. The social fabric that holds a small band together breaks down at scale, and something has to replace it to prevent the society from dissolving into chaos. Historically, the thing that replaced it was increasingly centralized political authority, chiefdoms, and eventually states and empires, with formal laws, standing administrative structures, and centralized control over the surplus that the agricultural base had generated in the first place. So the chain that began with which wild plants and animals happened to be available for domestication in a particular region eventually produces, through this cascading mechanism of surplus, specialization, density, and political centralization, the kind of large, complex, technologically sophisticated, militarily organized societies that would eventually be capable of building ocean-going ships, forging steel weapons, and projecting power across continents. In the next section, we turn to perhaps the most quietly devastating part of Diamond's entire argument, the germs and the brutal, largely invisible role that infectious disease played in deciding the outcome of contact between societies that had followed dramatically different paths up this chain. When most people imagine the European conquest of the Americas, they picture muskets, cannons, steel swords, and armoured cavalry overwhelming indigenous warriors armed with comparatively primitive weapons. That image is not wrong, but Diamond argues, with substantial historical and epidemiological evidence behind him, that it radically understates the single deadliest force at work in that conquest, a force that arrived invisibly, often ahead of the Europeans themselves, and killed far more people than any battlefield ever did. That force was infectious disease, and understanding why it devastated the Americas, Australia, and the Pacific Islands so catastrophically, while doing comparatively little equivalent damage in the other direction, requires going back once again to the domesticated animals discussed earlier in this video. Most of history's most lethal infectious diseases, smallpox, measles, influenza, tuberculosis in some of its forms, and several others, are believed by epidemiologists to have originated as diseases of domesticated animals that mutated over many generations of close contact into forms capable of infecting and spreading between humans. Smallpox is believed to be related to a cattle disease. Measles likely evolved from a virus closely related to one that infects cattle as well. Influenza strains regularly originate in domesticated birds and pigs, jumping into human populations after mutation. This means that the same Eurasian societies that won the domestication lottery, described earlier in this video, gaining access to cattle, pigs, horses, sheep, and goats, also paid an enormous price for that access over many centuries, as living in close, constant contact with these animals exposed Eurasian populations repeatedly to novel animal-borne pathogens. Crucially, though, this price came with a brutal kind of compensation over time. Populations that were repeatedly exposed to a disease over many generations gradually built up partial genetic and immunological resistance to it, through a harsh, grinding process of natural selection in which the people most susceptible to severe illness or death from a given disease tended to die at higher rates, particularly as children, before having the chance to pass on their more vulnerable genetic makeup, while the more resistant individuals survived and reproduced. Over enough generations, this raised the average resistance of the entire population, even though it did so through an enormous, largely forgotten toll of repeated epidemic death across earlier centuries. By the time European explorers began crossing the Atlantic and Pacific Oceans in significant numbers, their populations carried genetic and acquired immunological resistance to a whole suite of diseases that had been quietly culling susceptible Europeans for over 1,000 years. Indigenous populations in the Americas, Australia, and many Pacific islands had an overwhelmingly different history. Because these regions had few or no domesticable large mammals, as discussed in Section 4, their populations had never been exposed to the same battery of animal-derived pathogens and had therefore never gone through the brutal multi-generational selective process that gradually built up resistance in Eurasian populations. When European explorers, colonists, and their domesticated animals arrived carrying smallpox, measles, influenza, and other diseases, indigenous populations encountered these pathogens for the first time in their collective history, with no inherited immunological resistance and often no cultural knowledge of effective quarantine or treatment practices for diseases that behaved in completely unfamiliar ways. The resulting mortality was almost unimaginably severe. Historians and epidemiologists estimate that in many regions of the Americas, somewhere between 70 and 90% of the indigenous population died within the first century or so of sustained contact with European diseases, a death toll that occurred predominantly through epidemic disease rather than direct violence, even though violence and disruption of food systems and social structures certainly compounded the disaster. This had a military and political consequence that Diamond emphasizes repeatedly. Spanish conquistadors like Hernán Cortés and Francisco Pizarro were able to topple enormous, populous, highly organized empires like the Aztec and Inca, with forces numbering in the hundreds, an outcome that seems almost impossible to explain through weaponry and tactics alone, however significant steel weapons and cavalry were. Diamond argues that epidemic disease, often arriving ahead of the Europeans themselves through indirect contact, had already devastated and destabilized these empires before direct. Military conflict even began, killing rulers, disrupting succession, collapsing administrative structures, and demoralizing surviving populations in ways that made conquest by a small armed force possible in a way it never would have been against a healthy, fully intact empire. This is, in many ways, the bleakest part of Diamond's entire thesis. The same accident of geography that gave Eurasian societies guns and steel also gave them, almost as an unintended byproduct, a biological weapon far more lethal than any deliberately designed one. And indigenous peoples on the receiving end of European contact had no equivalent biological arsenal to send back in return, because the same lack of domesticable animals that limited their food surplus also meant they had never developed comparably devastating diseases of their own to share with the explorers who arrived on their shores. In the next section, we widen the lens and look at how the shape and orientation of entire continents, not just the plants and animals within them, played a decisive role in how quickly agriculture, technology, and disease resistance could actually spread once they developed somewhere. One of the most elegant and most widely discussed arguments in Guns, Germs, and Steel is what Diamond calls the differential rates of diffusion across continents, and it begins with a deceptively simple observation. If you look at a world map and ignore everything except the basic shape and orientation of the major continents, Eurasia is oriented primarily along an east-west axis, while Africa and the Americas are oriented primarily along a north-south axis. This single geometric fact, Diamond argues, had enormous and largely underappreciated consequences for how quickly agricultural innovations, domesticated species, and technology could spread once they were developed anywhere on those continents. The reason this matters comes down to climate. Locations that share the same approximate latitude, meaning locations arranged along an east-west line, tend to share broadly similar climates, day-length patterns, and seasonal cycles, even if they are separated by enormous distances. A crop or domesticated animal that thrives in one location along a given line of latitude has a reasonably good chance of also thriving in another location along that same approximate latitude, even thousands of miles away, because the growing conditions, temperature ranges, and rainfall patterns tend to be broadly comparable. This meant that once wheat, barley, cattle, sheep, and other domesticated species developed in the Fertile Crescent, they were able to spread relatively quickly both east and west across the similarly latitudinal expanse of Eurasia, reaching India, China, North Africa, and Europe within a few thousand years, because farmers in those distant regions could adopt these same crops and animals with comparatively modest adaptation. Compare this to Africa and the Americas, both of which stretch primarily along a north-south axis, meaning that movement across these continents typically also means movement across dramatically different climate zones. A crop or animal adapted to the cool highlands of the Andes faces enormous challenges thriving in the tropical lowlands of the Amazon basin just a few hundred miles away, let alone making the journey all the way to the temperate regions of what is now the eastern United States. A crop domesticated in the Sahel region of West Africa faces similarly enormous climatic barriers trying to spread south into the dense rainforest regions of Central Africa, or further south still into the dramatically different conditions of Southern Africa. This meant that agricultural innovations in the Americas and Africa tended to spread far more slowly, often requiring centuries of incremental local adaptation and redomestication at each new climate zone, compared to the relatively swift east-west diffusion that Eurasian innovations enjoyed. Diamond extends this same logic beyond agriculture to technology and ideas more broadly. Writing systems, mathematical knowledge, military technology, and administrative techniques developed anywhere within the broad east-west expanse of Eurasia had a geographic pathway to spread relatively efficiently to other Eurasian societies operating under broadly similar climatic and ecological conditions. a useful innovation developed in Mesopotamia or China had a real chance of eventually reaching Europe or India through a long chain of trade, contact, and adoption across reasonably similar latitudes, even without any direct contact between the original inventors and the eventual adopters. The geography of Africa and the Americas made this same kind of broad diffusion considerably harder. Not impossible, but slower and more constrained, meaning that useful innovations developed in one region of these continents were less likely to spread efficiently to other regions facing dramatically different environmental conditions. This geographic factor compounds with the domestication factors discussed earlier in ways that Diamond argues are easy to underestimate. It is not simply that the Fertile Crescent happened to have productive domesticable plants and animals. It is that the entire Eurasian landmass, stretching from the Atlantic coast of Europe to the Pacific coast of China, was oriented in exactly the right way to allow those domesticated species, once developed, to diffuse across an enormous geographic range relatively quickly, multiplying their impact across dozens of distinct societies that all benefited from agricultural advances they themselves had not had to independently invent. Meanwhile, societies in the Americas and sub-Saharan Africa, even when they did make genuinely impressive independent agricultural innovations, often found those innovations geographically bottlenecked, unable to spread efficiently to potentially receptive populations just a few hundred miles to the north or south because of the harsh climatic transitions standing in the way. Diamond is careful throughout this section to emphasize that this is purely a geometric and climatic accident, with no relationship whatsoever to the ingenuity of the peoples involved. The orientation of continents was determined by tectonic and geological processes operating over hundreds of millions of years, long before any human society existed to be helped or hindered by it. In the next section, we turn to a related but distinct geographic factor that Diamond identifies: the question of fragmentation versus connectivity within regions, and how this shaped not agricultural diffusion specifically, but the pace and competitive pressure behind technological innovation itself. Beyond the broad east-west versus north-south orientation of continents, Diamond identifies a second geographic variable that shaped the pace of technological development in different regions: the degree to which a region's internal geography encouraged or discouraged connectivity, competition, and the free flow of ideas between distinct political and cultural groups. This argument becomes especially interesting when Diamond uses it to explain a puzzle that might otherwise seem to contradict his broader thesis, namely why China, despite having an enormous population, productive agriculture, and a substantial early technological lead in many areas, including printing, gunpowder, and ocean-going shipbuilding, was eventually overtaken by European societies in the long run, despite Europe's comparatively fragmented and frequently warring political landscape. Diamond's explanation centers on a balance between unity and fragmentation. A region that is too fragmented, divided into countless small, isolated, mutually hostile groups with very little contact or exchange between them, tends to struggle with technological progress because useful innovations developed in one small group have limited opportunity to spread, be refined, and be built upon by others. A region that is too unified under a single centralized authority, however, carries a different risk. If that single ruling authority makes a decision to halt or restrict a particular technology or practice for whatever political, ideological, or economic reason, there is no competing political entity nearby to continue pursuing that technology instead, and the innovation can simply stall or disappear across the entire region simultaneously. Diamond argues that China, for most of its history, fell into something closer to this second category. Although Chinese civilization saw long periods of extraordinary technological innovation, the relatively unified political structure of Chinese empires meant that key decisions made by a single imperial court could have outsized region-wide consequences. The most famous example Diamond cites involves Chinese ocean-going exploration in the early 15th century. Admiral Zheng He led an extraordinary series of naval expeditions with fleets of ships far larger and more sophisticated than anything Europe could produce at the time, reaching as far as the eastern coast of Africa, decades before European explorers achieved comparable feats. Yet a change in imperial court politics in China led to a decision to dismantle the treasure fleet, ban further ocean-going expeditions, and even destroy existing shipbuilding capacity and records, a decision that, because Chinese political authority was so unified, applied across the entire empire, with no competing Chinese political center to continue the project independently. Within a few generations, the very real Chinese lead in ocean-going exploration had been entirely abandoned, opening a path for European powers to eventually dominate global oceanic trade and exploration instead. Europe, by contrast, was politically fragmented into a constantly shifting patchwork of competing kingdoms, city-states and principalities throughout most of its history, all close enough to each other to maintain meaningful contact, trade and rivalry, but distinct enough that no single political decision could simultaneously halt an innovation across the entire region. Diamond points to the well-documented historical episode in which Christopher Columbus, after being rejected by the Portuguese crown for his proposed westward voyage, was able to simply approach a different European monarchy, the Spanish crown, and eventually secure funding there instead. Had Europe been unified under a single political authority the way China was, a single rejection could have ended the entire project. Because Europe was fragmented into competing political entities, an idea rejected in one place could often find support somewhere else nearby, and the competitive pressure between rival European powers, each eager to gain an advantage over its neighbours and rivals, created a sustained incentive to continue developing and adopting new military, naval, and economic technologies rather than letting any single innovation stall. Diamond is careful to frame this as a delicate middle ground rather than a simple rule that more fragmentation is always better. Excessive fragmentation, the kind found in parts of the highlands of New Guinea, where small isolated groups speaking hundreds of distinct languages had very limited contact even with their immediate neighbours, tends to slow innovation just as severely as excessive unification, because there simply isn't enough exchange of people, ideas, and competitive pressure to drive sustained. Technological development. Europe's particular geography, a continent broken up by mountain ranges, peninsulas, and significant but not insurmountable bodies of water, happened to produce a level of fragmentation that fell into a kind of productive middle zone, fragmented enough to maintain multiple independent centres of political and technological competition, but connected enough that ideas, people, and innovations could still circulate relatively freely between them. China's geography, by contrast, with its more unified river systems and more centrally connected core agricultural regions, tended to produce political unification more easily and more durably, which carried real advantages in administrative efficiency and internal stability, but also carried this specific vulnerability to innovation-halting decisions made by a single central authority. In the next section, we step back from the deep historical mechanics of the argument and look directly at how Diamond applies all of this machinery to the most dramatic and most studied case in the entire book: the conquest of the Inca Empire by a tiny Spanish force under Francisco Pizarro. If there is a single historical event that Diamond returns to again and again throughout Guns, Germs, and Steel as a concentrated, almost laboratory-perfect demonstration of his entire thesis, it is the conquest of the Inca Empire by Francisco Pizarro and his small Spanish force in 1532. The basic facts of this encounter on their surface seem almost impossible to explain through any simple military logic. The Inca Empire at the time was one of the largest and most sophisticated political entities in the world, controlling a territory stretching for thousands of miles along the western coast of South America, with a population numbering in the millions, a sophisticated road and administrative system, and a substantial professional military. Pizarro's force, by contrast, consisted of fewer than 200 Spanish soldiers arriving in unfamiliar terrain, thousands of miles from any reinforcement or resupply. By any conventional measure of relative population, territory, and available manpower, this should have been an overwhelming and immediate Inca victory. Instead, within a matter of months, Pizarro's tiny force captured the Inca Emperor Atahualpa, effectively decapitating the empire's command structure, and within a few years, Spanish control over the core Inca territories was firmly established. Diamond argues that understanding this outcome requires looking at every single element of the framework developed across the rest of the book operating simultaneously and in combination, rather than looking for any single decisive factor on its own. First, there is the element of guns and steel directly. Spanish soldiers carried steel swords, armour, and in some cases primitive firearms, all of which were the product of a long Eurasian metallurgical tradition stretching back thousands of years, made possible by the same chain of agricultural surplus, specialization, and accumulated technological refinement discussed earlier in this video. Inca soldiers, while skilled, disciplined, and operating within a highly organized military structure, fought primarily with weapons made of wood, stone, and copper or bronze, materials considerably less effective against steel armor and blades in direct combat. Second, there are horses. The Inca Empire, like the rest of the pre-contact Americas, had no domesticated large mammal suitable for cavalry, because, as discussed earlier, the Americas had lost almost all of their candidate large mammal species to extinction shortly after the arrival of the first human populations there. Inca soldiers had never in their entire history encountered a mounted opponent, and the psychological and tactical shock of facing armoured men on horseback for the first time, combined with the very real physical advantages cavalry provides in speed, height, and shock impact during a charge, contributed significantly to the chaos and panic that characterized the Spanish capture of Atahualpa at the Battle of Cajamarca. Third, and Diamond argues most decisively, there is the role of disease, even though its effects here are somewhat less direct than in some other regions of the Americas. Smallpox had already begun spreading through the Inca Empire in the years before Pizarro's arrival, having travelled overland from earlier Spanish contact with other parts of Central America, arriving in Peru ahead of any direct Spanish presence there. This earlier wave of disease had killed the reigning Inca Emperor Huayna Capac and his designated heir, triggering a brutal civil war of succession between two of his surviving sons, Huáscar and Atahualpa, that had only just concluded, with enormous loss of life and political stability, in the months immediately before Pizarro's arrival. Pizarro, in other words, did not encounter a healthy, stable, unified Inca Empire at the peak of its strength. He encountered an empire already reeling from a devastating epidemic and a brutal internal civil war, its administrative and military structures already badly weakened and divided, its population already substantially reduced, in the immediate aftermath of one of the most destabilizing periods in its entire history. Fourth, there is the matter of writing and information, a factor Diamond emphasizes that is easy to overlook. The Inca Empire, despite its administrative sophistication, did not have a writing system in the conventional sense, relying instead on a system of knotted cords called quipu for record keeping, which, while genuinely effective for certain administrative purposes, did not allow for the same kind of detailed strategic intelligence gathering, historical record keeping, and forewarning that Spanish forces, drawing on written accounts of earlier encounters with other indigenous peoples in Mexico and Central America, were able to use to their advantage. The Spanish arrived with substantial accumulated knowledge, however imperfect, of indigenous American tactics, vulnerabilities, and political structures from previous encounters. The Inca had essentially no comparable accumulated knowledge of European tactics, weapons, or intentions, because nothing like a Spanish incursion had ever happened to them before, and no writing system existed to transmit detailed warnings even if such information had somehow reached them in time. Diamond's broader point in walking through this case in such detail is that no single element of his framework alone fully explains the outcome. It was not simply guns, it was not simply horses, it was not simply disease. It was the combination of all of these factors arriving together, compounding on each other, each one ultimately traceable back to the deep historical accident of which continent happened to have access, to which domesticable plants and animals, oriented along which geographic axis, thousands of years before either Pizarro or Atahualpa were ever born. In the next section, we widen our scope again to look at how this same framework plays out, with somewhat different specifics, in Diamond's treatment of the colonisation of Australia and the devastating impact of contact on Aboriginal Australian societies. Australia occupies a particularly important place in Diamond's argument, because it represents perhaps the most extreme case of geographic isolation among all the inhabited continents, and the consequences of that isolation illustrate his thesis in an unusually clear way. Aboriginal Australians had lived on the continent for an estimated 40 to 60,000 years before European contact, an extraordinarily long span of continuous habitation that produced deep, sophisticated knowledge of the Australian environment, intricate social and kinship structures, rich oral traditions, and highly effective techniques for managing one of the most challenging and resource-scarce environments inhabited by any human population on Earth. Diamond is emphatic, just as he was with New Guinea, that none of what follows should be read as suggesting Aboriginal Australians were less intelligent, less capable, or less sophisticated than the European populations that eventually colonised their continent. The divergence in technological and political development between Aboriginal Australian societies and the societies of Eurasia traces back once again to the specific resources available on the Australian continent itself. Australia geologically and ecologically presented an unusually difficult environment for the development of agriculture. The continent's soil is, on average, considerably older and more nutrient depleted than the soils of most other inhabited continents, having not benefited from the same recent glacial and volcanic processes that replenished soil fertility elsewhere. Australia's climate is also unusually unpredictable, even by the standards of arid and semi-arid regions elsewhere in the world, with rainfall patterns driven by climate phenomena that produce extreme and difficult to predict cycles of drought and flood. Critically, Australia, like the Americas, lost almost all of its larger native mammal species in a wave of extinctions, in this case occurring even earlier and more completely than in the Americas, leaving the continent with essentially no candidate species for large animal domestication at all. Combined with a native flora that contained very few wild plant species meeting the demanding domestication criteria discussed earlier in this video, these factors meant that Aboriginal Australian societies, despite tens of thousands of years of continuous habitation and immense accumulated environmental knowledge, never independently developed agriculture in the way that societies in the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, and several other regions eventually did. Without an agricultural base capable of generating the kind of substantial storable food surplus discussed in Section 5, Aboriginal Australian societies generally remained organised around small mobile bands and clans, moving across the landscape in patterns adapted to seasonal resource availability, with social and political structures built around kinship rather than the large-scale centralised states that agricultural surplus elsewhere eventually produced. This is not, Diamond stresses, evidence of any inferiority in social organisation. Aboriginal Australian kinship and land management systems were, in fact, remarkably sophisticated, including controlled burning practices that actively shaped the landscape and ecology of the continent over thousands of years in ways that Western science only began to properly appreciate relatively recently. But this form of social organisation did not generate the same population density, occupational specialisation, metallurgy, or, critically, accumulated disease resistance that agricultural Eurasian societies had developed over thousands of years of dense, settled life in close contact with domesticated animals. When British colonisation began in 1788, the consequences followed the same brutal pattern observed elsewhere in the Americas, amplified by Australia's even more extreme isolation. Aboriginal Australian populations had no historical exposure to smallpox, measles, influenza, or the other major Eurasian epidemic diseases, and epidemic outbreaks following European contact devastated Aboriginal populations with the speed and severity comparable to, and in some specific outbreaks possibly exceeding, the mortality rates documented in the Americas. Beyond disease, the technological gap in weaponry between British colonial forces and Aboriginal Australian groups, who had no access to metalworking traditions given the absence of metal or processing techniques that had developed independently on their isolated continent, compounded the demographic disaster caused by disease, contributing to a colonisation process that, within little more than a century, had displaced Aboriginal Australian populations from the vast majority of their traditional lands. Diamond uses the Australian case specifically to push back hard against any reader who might still be tempted, even after the New Guinea and Inca discussions, to read some kind of inherent capability gap into these outcomes. Aboriginal Australians had occupied their continent for tens of thousands of years, longer than agricultural Eurasian societies had occupied theirs, demonstrating extraordinary long-term ecological knowledge and survival skill in one of the harshest inhabited environments on the planet. The difference in outcome upon contact traces back entirely to the specific resources, plants, animals, and geographic isolation of the Australian continent itself, not to any difference in the people who lived there. In the next section, we turn to one of the most direct comparative test cases Diamond offers in the entire book, his close study of the Polynesian settlement of the Pacific Islands, which functions almost like a natural experiment demonstrating his thesis using a single shared ancestral population spread across radically different environments. One of the most compelling pieces of evidence Diamond offers in support of his geographic thesis doesn't come from comparing entirely different peoples on different continents at all. It comes from a single closely related population, the Polynesians, who spread out across the islands of the Pacific Ocean over roughly 2,000 years, starting from a shared ancestral culture and settling on islands that ranged enormously in size, climate, soil quality, and available natural resources. because the settlers of these various islands shared essentially the same genetic stock, the same founding cultural traditions, and many of the same founding technologies and domesticated species, including pigs, dogs, and chickens, and the same crops like taro and breadfruit. The dramatic differences that eventually emerged between different Polynesian societies provide an unusually clean natural experiment for testing whether environment alone, independent of any difference in the underlying population, can produce dramatically different social and political outcomes. The results, as Diamond documents in detail, are striking. On small, resource-poor islands like the Chatham Islands, settled by Polynesian voyagers known as the Moriori, the population that developed over subsequent centuries reverted toward a relatively simple, low-density, non-hierarchical social structure, largely because the limited resources of the islands could not support the population density needed for more complex social and political organisation. On larger, more fertile islands like Tonga and Hawaii, Polynesian settlers developed into some of the most centralised, hierarchical, and politically sophisticated societies anywhere in the pre-industrial Pacific world, complete with powerful hereditary chiefly classes, organised warfare, monumental construction projects, and complex systems of tribute and resource redistribution, all developed independently from the same originating cultural stock as the Chatham Islanders, simply because the larger, more fertile environment could sustain the population density and food surplus necessary to support this level of political complexity. New Zealand presents an especially dramatic case within this same framework. The Maori, who settled New Zealand from the same broad Polynesian cultural background, encountered a substantially larger landmass, with a more temperate climate than most other Pacific islands, allowing for a denser population and a more complex, often warlike political structure organised around competing tribal groups, extensive fortified settlements, and sophisticated agricultural techniques adapted to a cooler climate than most other Polynesian destinations. When Moriori and Maori populations eventually came into direct contact in the 19th century, after Maori raiding parties travelled to the Chatham Islands, the very same Polynesian cultural lineage that had diverged centuries earlier under different environmental conditions produced a conflict in which the more densely populated, more militarily organised Maori inflicted catastrophic violence on the more sparsely populated and far less militarily organised Moriori, an outcome that, within the logic of Diamond's argument, mirrors in miniature, and on a compressed timescale, the same broad pattern that played out between Eurasian and non-Eurasian societies on a much larger continental scale. Diamond's use of the Polynesian case is particularly effective as a piece of supporting evidence precisely because it controls for the factor that critics of his broader thesis most often raise as an alternative explanation: inherited differences between distinct populations. The Moriori, the Maori, the Tongans, and the Hawaiians were not separate, unrelated peoples with potentially different inherited capacities. They were closely related populations descending from the same ancestral Polynesian culture within a relatively short historical time frame, who diverged dramatically in social and political complexity purely as a function of the dramatically different environments, in terms of size, fertility, and resource availability that their ancestors happened to settle. If environment alone, without any difference in the underlying population, can produce outcomes ranging from small egalitarian bands to large hierarchical chiefdoms with organised standing warrior classes within the relatively compressed time frame of Polynesian Pacific settlement, Diamond argues, this provides strong supporting evidence that the same basic mechanism, environment shaping social complexity through the chain of food surplus, population density and specialisation, can plausibly explain the much larger and more dramatic divergences observed between entirely separate continental populations over a much longer historical time frame. In the next section, we step back from these individual case studies and look at how Diamond extends his argument specifically to explain the technological trajectory of China, a civilization whose early and sustained sophistication poses one of the more interesting challenges to any simple Eurocentric reading of world history. Any honest account of pre-modern world history has to grapple seriously with China, because for most of recorded history, China was not behind the rest of Eurasia in technological and administrative sophistication. It was substantially ahead of it. Chinese civilization independently developed paper, printing, gunpowder, the compass, sophisticated cast iron metallurgy centuries before comparable European techniques, complex hydraulic engineering projects, and a centralized bureaucratic administrative system that governed an enormous, densely populated territory with a level of organisational sophistication that medieval Europe, fragmented into competing feudal territories, could not match for much of the same period. If Diamond's argument was simply that Eurasia as a whole had geographic advantages that non-Eurasian continents lacked, this raises an obvious follow-up question that any careful reader should ask. Why didn't China, with its substantial early technological lead, end up as the dominant global power of the modern era, rather than the comparatively fragmented and frequently warring kingdoms of Western Europe? Diamond's answer to this question builds directly on the fragmentation and connectivity argument developed in Section 8, but extends it further by examining the specific internal geography of China itself. China's core agricultural heartland developed around two major river systems, the Yellow River in the north and the Yangtze River in the south, both running through relatively continuous interconnected lowland terrain without the kind of severe internal geographic barriers, mountain ranges, deep peninsulas and major water obstacles that fragmented Europe into so many distinct defensible political units. This relatively unified, interconnected internal geography meant that Chinese civilization tended towards political unification fairly early in its history, and maintained that unification, with periods of fragmentation during dynastic transitions and civil wars more durably than fragmented Europe ever managed, since the underlying geography didn't provide the same natural defensive barriers that allowed dozens of distinct European political entities to maintain independent existence over many centuries. This tendency toward unification carried real and substantial advantages for long stretches of Chinese history, including more efficient large-scale infrastructure projects, more effective internal trade and communication, and a level of administrative sophistication that genuinely outpaced fragmented medieval Europe in many respects. But Diamond argues this same tendency toward unification eventually became a liability in a specific structural way, because a unified political system concentrates enormous decision-making power in a single court or central authority, and history offers a sobering case study in just how costly a single bad decision from that central authority could become for an entire civilization, precisely because there was no competing independent political centre within China positioned to simply continue a project that the central authority had decided to abandon. The dismantling of Admiral Zheng He's treasure fleet, discussed earlier in the Section 8, stands as Diamond's central example of this dynamic, but he extends the same logic to other instances throughout Chinese history, where shifts in imperial court politics, religious or ideological currents, or factional disputes among advisors to the emperor produced sweeping policy changes that simultaneously affected the entire empire, with no alternative centre of power available to preserve a different approach. Europe's fragmentation, while carrying real costs in terms of near-constant warfare, instability, and the inefficiencies of competing, overlapping, and sometimes directly conflicting political authorities also meant that no single bad decision, no single change in religious or political fashion at any individual court could simultaneously halt an innovation or a line of exploration across the entire continent. Diamond's earlier example of Columbus shopping, his proposal for a westward voyage between rival European monarchies after being rejected by Portugal, illustrates this dynamic precisely, and he suggests that countless similar episodes in shipbuilding, in weapons technology, in finance and in scientific inquiry played out across European history, with innovations and ideas rejected or suppressed in one kingdom or principality frequently finding fertile ground somewhere else nearby instead. Over centuries, this sustained, competitive, fragmented political environment, combined with the relatively easy internal connectivity that still allowed ideas, technologies and people to circulate between. European states, despite their political fragmentation, produced a cumulative rate of technological and institutional innovation that eventually overtook China's earlier, more unified, but ultimately more centrally vulnerable trajectory. Diamond is careful to frame this as a genuinely contingent historical outcome rather than an inevitable one. He explicitly notes that had certain specific decisions gone differently, in 15th century China, the long-term trajectory of global power could plausibly have unfolded very differently, with Chinese rather than European powers eventually dominating global trade routes, exploration, and colonization. In the next section, we turn to one of the most pointed and frequently cited criticisms of Diamond's entire framework, the charge that his thesis amounts to a form of geographic determinism that understates the role of human choice, culture, and historical contingency in shaping outcomes. No serious discussion of guns, germs, and steel can avoid confronting the most persistent and most substantive criticism levelled against it. A criticism that has come not primarily from fringe commentators but from respected historians, anthropologists, and geographers working directly in the fields the book draws on. The core of this criticism is the charge of geographic determinism, the claim that Diamond's framework, despite its explicit and repeated insistence that no people are inherently more capable than any other, nonetheless ends up treating human societies as largely passive products of their environment, with relatively little genuine agency, creativity, or meaningful choice in shaping their own historical trajectories. If geography essentially determines which societies will develop agriculture, food surplus, dense population, specialization, and eventually advanced technology and centralized political organization, critics ask, then what role is actually left for human decision-making, cultural variation, individual leadership, or historical contingency in explaining why history unfolded the way it did? Historians working on specific regions have pointed to numerous cases where societies occupying broadly similar environments, with access to broadly similar resources, nonetheless developed in dramatically different directions, suggesting that environmental factors alone cannot fully account for the observed historical outcomes. Critics have also pointed out that Diamond's framework, by focusing so heavily on the ultimate causes operating over millennia, tends to underweight the proximate causes operating over decades and centuries. The specific political decisions, cultural and religious developments, individual leadership choices, and historically contingent events that shaped how any particular society actually used the environmental hand it had been dealt. Some critics have argued that this emphasis, however well-intentioned in its goal of avoiding racist explanations, ends up replacing one form of determinism, biological determinism rooted in supposed racial differences, with another form of determinism, geographic determinism rooted in environmental differences, and that both forms ultimately understate the genuine creativity, agency, and historical contingency that real human societies have exercised throughout history. Anthropologists in particular have raised concerns about how Diamond's framework handles culture as an explanatory variable. Critics argue that Diamond tends to treat cultural practices, religious beliefs, political institutions, and social structures primarily as downstream consequences of underlying environmental and material conditions, rather than as independent forces that can themselves shape historical outcomes in ways not fully reducible to geography. A society's specific religious traditions, its particular approach to property rights and resource management, its attitudes toward trade, warfare, or innovation, critics argue, are not simply passive byproducts of available domesticable species and continental geography. They involve genuine human choices, contested debates, and contingent historical developments that can meaningfully diverge even between societies facing broadly similar environmental starting conditions. Diamond himself has responded to versions of this criticism, both in later editions of the book and in subsequent writing and interviews, generally by clarifying that he does not intend his argument as a complete, exhaustive explanation that leaves no room whatsoever for cultural variation, individual agency, or historical contingency, but rather as an account of the broad, large-scale patterns and constraints that operate over very long timescales and across large populations, within which considerable room remains for cultural variation and human choice to operate at smaller scales and shorter timeframes. He has argued that explaining why, in the very broadest possible strokes, Eurasian societies as a whole ended up with more advanced metallurgy, more centralized political structures, and greater accumulated disease resistance than indigenous American, sub-Saharan African, Aboriginal, Australian, or Pacific Island societies as a whole, is a meaningfully different and more tractable question than explaining every specific detail of why one particular European kingdom rather than another ended up leading a particular wave of exploration, or why one particular Chinese dynasty rather than another made a particular policy decision. The first kind of question, Diamond maintains, is the one his book is actually trying to answer, and he argues that geographic and environmental factors do a genuinely strong job of explaining outcomes at that very broad level of analysis, even while readily acknowledging that they explain considerably less at finer levels of historical detail. Whether this defense fully satisfies his critics remains a genuinely contested question within the relevant academic fields, and reasonable, well-informed scholars continue to disagree about exactly how much explanatory weight geography alone can bear before culture, politics, and individual human choice need to be given equal or greater billing in the explanation. In the next section, we look at a second major line of criticism. This one focused specifically on whether Diamond's account adequately captures the historical experience and agency of the very societies, including New Guinea, whose situation originally inspired the book. A second significant line of criticism directed at Guns, Germs, and Almond Steel concerns not the structure of its argument but its actual treatment of the specific non-Eurasian societies that feature throughout the book, and whether that treatment, despite Diamond's explicitly stated anti-racist intentions, ends up reproducing some of the same flattening, externally imposed narrative structures that the book's central argument was supposed to dismantle. This criticism has come with particular force from historians and anthropologists who specialize in the specific regions Diamond discusses, including scholars of Indigenous American history, African history, and Pacific history, several of whom have argued that Diamond's account, despite its genuinely sympathetic intentions, tends to describe these societies primarily as the recipients of historical forces, geography, disease, and the technological output of other societies, rather than as the authors of their own rich, complex, internally dynamic histories. Specialist historians of Mesoamerica and the Andes, for example, have pointed out that Diamond's treatment of pre-Columbian American civilizations, while certainly more sympathetic and more scientifically grounded than older racist accounts, still tends to compress enormously complex, internally diverse civilizational histories spanning thousands of years and dozens of distinct cultures, languages, and political systems into a relatively brief discussion focused primarily on explaining why these societies eventually lost contact with Eurasian colonizers, rather than treating the internal history, achievements, and dynamics of these civilizations as worthy of sustained attention in their own right. Similarly, scholars of African history have noted that sub-Saharan Africa's internal political, economic, and cultural history, including substantial periods of state formation, long-distance trade networks, and metallurgical innovation that predate European contact, receives comparatively less detailed attention in Diamond's account than the explanation for why Africa's domestication options were limited, leaving readers with a relatively thin picture of the actual lived political and cultural history of the continent prior to and alongside European colonization. A related criticism raised by some scholars working specifically on Pacific and New Guinean history and anthropology concerns the framing established by Yali's question itself, the very anecdote the book opens with. Some critics have argued that by structuring the entire book as an answer to a question about why New Guineans lack cargo compared to Europeans, Diamond, even while explicitly rejecting any claim of inherent New Guinean inferiority, nonetheless implicitly accepts cargo accumulation and technological complexity as the primary default measure of a society's historical success or development, a framing that some Pacific and indigenous scholars argue reflects a deeply Western and arguably still somewhat ethnocentric set of values about what counts as meaningful human achievement, rather than engaging more fully with the distinct value system, social structures, ecological knowledge, and cultural achievements that New Guinean and other indigenous societies have developed and maintained on their own terms, independent of how those achievements compare to European industrial output. Diamond's defenders, and to some extent Diamond himself in later writing, have responded to these criticisms by arguing that the book was never intended as a comprehensive history of any of the specific societies it discusses, but rather as a focused argument addressing one particular narrowly defined historical puzzle, the relative distribution of certain specific kinds of technological and political power across different world regions, and that criticizing the book for not also serving as a comprehensive, internally focused history of Mesoamerica, Sub-Saharan Africa, or New Guinea, somewhat misunderstands the specific bounded scope of the Project Diamond actually set out to complete. There is a genuine tension here that thoughtful readers have to sit with rather than resolve too quickly in either direction. The book performs a genuinely valuable service in providing a scientifically grounded alternative to centuries of racist pseudo-explanation for global inequality, and it does so while explicitly affirming the equal underlying capability of all human populations. At the same time, the specific way the book frames its central question, and the relatively limited attention it gives to the internal richness and complexity of the non-Eurasian societies it discusses, leaves real room for the criticism that even a well-intentioned, scientifically rigorous account centered on explaining a gap in cargo accumulation can end up reinforcing, even if unintentionally, a worldview in which European industrial technological output remains the implicit benchmark against which all other societies are measured and found relatively wanting. In the next section, we turn to a more technical scientific criticism of the book, focused specifically on questions raised by archaeologists and geneticists about some of the specific empirical claims Diamond makes regarding domestication timelines and agricultural origins. Beyond the broader conceptual criticisms of geographic determinism and representational fairness discussed in the previous two sections, guns, germs, and steel has also faced more narrowly technical challenges from archaeologists, geneticists, and agricultural historians regarding some of its specific empirical claims, particularly around the timelines, locations, and processes of early plant and animal domestication. Diamond wrote the book in the mid-1990s, drawing on the best available archaeological and genetic evidence at the time, but the fields of archaeogenetics and archaeobotany have advanced substantially since then, and some of the specific findings Diamond relied on have since been revised, refined, or in certain cases significantly complicated by subsequent research. One area of revision concerns the geography and chronology of agricultural origins outside the Fertile Crescent. Diamond's original account, reflecting the dominant scholarly consensus of the 1990s, generally portrayed agricultural innovation as occurring at a small number of clearly defined independent centres: the Fertile Crescent, China, Mesoamerica, the Andes, and a few others, with agriculture subsequently diffusing outward from these centres to surrounding regions. Subsequent archaeological and genetic research has complicated this picture in several regions, suggesting in some cases a more gradual, distributed, and less clearly centralised process of agricultural development than the relatively crisp model Diamond presented, with evidence in some regions for multiple independent or semi-independent domestication events occurring across broader geographic areas and longer timeframes than his original account suggested. Researchers studying African agricultural history in particular have pushed back against the relatively brief treatment Africa receives in Diamond's domestication discussion, arguing that more recent archaeological evidence reveals a richer, more complex, and in some respects earlier history of African plant domestication and agricultural innovation than the book's framework, built primarily around the contrast between Africa's domestication limitations and the Fertile Crescent's domestication advantages, fully captures. Geneticists studying the domestication history of specific crops and animals have also revised some of the specific timelines Diamond cites, with advances in ancient DNA analysis since the late 1990s providing considerably more precise, and in some cases substantially different dating for when and where specific domestication events occurred, compared to the archaeological dating methods available when Diamond was writing. Some of these revisions support Diamond's broader argument even more strongly than his original evidence did, while others complicate specific details of his account, suggesting more complex, multi-stage domestication processes occurring across broader geographic ranges than the relatively clean, geographically concentrated domestication centres his original narrative described. Archaeologists specialising in the peopling of the Americas have also raised questions about aspects of Diamond's treatment of New World agricultural and civilizational timelines, particularly regarding the speed and mechanisms of agricultural spread within the Americas, an area where ongoing archaeological discoveries continue to push back the dates of human arrival in the Americas and complicate the relatively straightforward narrative of agricultural diffusion that Diamond presents. Some scholars have also pushed back specifically on Diamond's treatment of the extinction of large American mammals discussed in Section 4, noting that the relative contributions of human hunting pressure versus natural climate change to the so-called Pleistocene megafauna extinctions remain genuinely debated among paleontologists and archaeologists, with some researchers assigning a larger role to climate factors and others to human hunting than Diamond's relatively confident treatment of the issue suggests the evidence fully supports. It's worth being clear about what these technical criticisms do and do not establish. They generally do not overturn Diamond's broad central thesis, that environmental and geographic factors played a major role in shaping the divergent trajectories of different world regions, a thesis that has found considerable independent support from subsequent research in economics, political science, and other fields examining the long-run effects of geography on development. What these criticisms do establish is that some of the specific evidentiary details Diamond used to support that broad thesis in the mid-1990s have since been refined, complicated, or in some cases substantially revised by. Subsequent research which is, in an important sense, exactly what should happen to any sufficiently ambitious scientific argument over nearly 3 decades of continued research in the relevant fields. A reader engaging with the book today benefits from understanding both the genuine continued strength of its broad architecture and the genuine need to treat some of its specific factual claims as reflecting the state of 1990s archaeological and genetic knowledge rather than the most current available evidence. In the next section, we turn to a different kind of follow-up question entirely, looking at how subsequent economists and political scientists have built on, tested, and in some cases extended Diamond's geographic framework using more formal quantitative methods. One of the more interesting developments in the decades following the publication of Guns, Germs, and Steel has been the way economists and political scientists, working with more formal statistical and quantitative methods than Diamond's largely narrative and comparative approach, have taken up versions of his central geographic thesis and subjected it to rigorous empirical testing using cross-country data on income, development, and institutional quality. This body of research, sometimes grouped under the broader label of the geography and development literature, has produced a genuinely interesting and somewhat mixed set of findings that both support and complicate Diamond's original argument in instructive ways. Some of the most prominent work in this tradition, including research by economists studying the long-run effects of agricultural transition timing on modern economic development, has found statistically significant relationships between how early a given region transitioned to agriculture in prehistory and that region's level of economic development today, a finding that lends substantial quantitative support to something like Diamond's core argument about the deep historical roots of contemporary global inequality. Other researchers have specifically tested Diamond's claims about the importance of domesticable plant and animal biodiversity, constructing detailed historical indices of how many domesticable large mammal species and productive crop species were available in different regions before the modern era, and have generally found that regions with greater historical access to these resources do show statistically meaningful long-run advantages in subsequent population density, urbanization, and economic development, providing independent quantitative confirmation of one of the central mechanisms Diamond proposed using primarily narrative and comparative historical evidence. However, this same body of quantitative research has also produced significant complications and qualifications to a simple, direct reading of Diamond's geography thesis. Perhaps the most influential and widely cited complication comes from research demonstrating what economists have called the reversal of fortune, the finding that some of the regions that were most prosperous and most densely populated in the pre-colonial era, often the same regions with the strongest geographic and agricultural advantages in Diamond's framework, ended up considerably poorer in the modern era than some regions that were comparatively sparsely populated and underdeveloped before European colonization. This reversal appears to be explained substantially by the different types of colonial institutions that European powers established in densely populated regions, where extractive institutions designed primarily to extract resources and labour from existing populations were often imposed, versus more sparsely populated regions, where European settlers established more inclusive, growth-oriented institutions, modelled more directly on their home institutions. Since they intended to settle permanently rather than simply extract resources, this research suggests that the institutional and political choices made during the colonial period, choices that are clearly the product of human agency and historically contingent decision-making rather than direct geographic determination, ended up mattering enormously for long-run development outcomes, in some cases overriding or even reversing the advantages that earlier geographic conditions had originally provided. This body of research provides a genuinely useful, more nuanced synthesis of the debate discussed in Section 13 regarding geographic determinism versus human agency. The evidence broadly suggests that geography mattered enormously in shaping the initial divergence between world regions in the deep pre-modern past, largely along the lines Diamond describes, but that subsequent historical events, particularly the specific institutional choices made during the era of European colonization, mattered just as significantly, and in some specific cases more significantly, in determining the economic outcomes actually observed in the modern world. In other words, geography set the table for the initial divergence in technological and political development that Diamond's book focuses on explaining. But it did not single-handedly write the entire subsequent script of global economic inequality as it exists today. Human institutional choices made during a relatively recent and well-documented historical period, the era of European colonial expansion from roughly the 16th through 20th centuries, played a decisive additional role that operates somewhat independently of the deep prehistoric geographic factors that Diamond's book is primarily concerned with. This synthesis suggests that the most intellectually honest way to engage with Diamond's thesis today is not to treat it as either fully correct or fully refuted, but to recognize it as identifying one genuinely important and well-supported layer of causation in a much larger, multi-layered historical story. A story that also includes substantial later chapters written by specific contingent human political and institutional choices that geography alone never fully determined. In the next section, we turn to perhaps the most morally weighted question the book raises, examining how Diamond's framework reshapes the ethical conversation around colonialism, conquest, and historical responsibility. One of the most significant and most discussed implications of Diamond's argument concerns how it reframes the broader public conversation around colonialism, conquest, and historical moral responsibility. And this is an area where the book's reception has been particularly complicated and contested. On one level, Diamond's framework performs a genuinely valuable service by definitively undercutting the old explicitly racist justification for European colonial expansion. The idea that Europeans deserved to dominate other peoples because they were inherently superior in intelligence, virtue, or civilizational capacity. By demonstrating in careful, evidence-based detail that the technological and political gap between Eurasian and non-Eurasian societies traces back to geographic accidents of plant and animal distribution, rather than any difference in the underlying capability of the peoples involved, Diamond provides a scientifically rigorous foundation for rejecting this racist justification entirely, replacing it with an account in which the relevant differences are due to luck rather than merit on either side. However, some critics, including thoughtful readers who are otherwise sympathetic to Diamond's broader scientific argument, have raised a genuine ethical concern about how this geographic reframing interacts with questions of historical moral responsibility for the actual violence, exploitation, and destruction that occurred during the colonial era. If the technological gap that enabled European conquest is best explained as an essentially impersonal accident of geography, set in motion thousands of years before any specific European colonizer or any specific indigenous victim of colonization was ever born, does this framing risk inadvertently softening or diffusing moral responsibility for the actual specific historically documented choices that individual European colonizers, governments, and institutions made once they possessed this technological advantage? Diamond's framework explains why Pizarro's forces had the capacity to defeat a much larger Inca force, but it does not, on its own, address the separate ethical question of how Pizarro and subsequent Spanish colonial administrators chose to use that capacity, including specific, well-documented decisions involving exploitation, forced labor, deliberate cultural destruction, and outright massacre that go well beyond anything required or determined by the underlying technological and epidemiological asymmetries the book describes. Diamond has addressed this concern directly in later writing and interviews, generally by drawing a clear distinction between explaining how a historical outcome became possible and justifying or excusing the specific moral choices that determined exactly how that possibility was actually realized. He has emphasized that his book is concerned entirely with the first question, the deep structural and geographic explanation for why the capacity for conquest existed asymmetrically between different world regions, and explicitly not with the second question, the moral evaluation of the specific historical choices that colonizers made once they possessed disproportionate technological power. Most thoughtful readers and reviewers have generally accepted this distinction as a reasonable and defensible one, recognizing that an explanation for why a particular historical asymmetry of power existed is not the same thing as a moral justification for how that power was subsequently exercised, in much the same way that explaining why a particular individual grew up with greater financial resources than another does not, on its own, excuse any specific harmful or exploitative choices the individual later made with those resources. At the same time, this distinction requires active, deliberate maintenance by readers and by anyone using Diamond's framework in broader public conversation, because the book's central, repeated emphasis on impersonal, deep historical geographic causation can create a rhetorical pull toward treating the entire colonial encounter as a kind of inevitable, almost natural process, rather than as a series of specific human decisions, many of them genuinely brutal and genuinely contingent rather than determined. made by specific historical actors who could plausibly have chosen differently within the technological and epidemiological circumstances they found themselves in. The most intellectually honest way to use Diamond's framework, most careful readers have concluded, is to treat it as a powerful and largely successful explanation for why a technological and epidemiological asymmetry existed in the first place, while keeping that explanation entirely separate from and never substituting it for the necessary ongoing moral and historical reckoning with the specific human choices, atrocities and exploitative systems that colonizers actually built once they possessed that asymmetric advantage. In the next section, we turn to the question of the book's broader legacy and influence, looking at how it has shaped subsequent popular and academic conversation about world history in the nearly 3 decades since its publication. Nearly 3 decades after its publication, Guns, Germs and Steel occupies an unusual and somewhat paradoxical position in both popular and academic conversation about world history. On the popular side, the book remains enormously influential, continuing to sell well, continuing to be assigned widely in university courses across multiple disciplines, and continuing to shape how millions of general readers around the world think about the deep historical roots of global inequality. The book's basic framework that environmental and geographic accident, rather than inherent racial or cultural superiority, explains the divergent paths of different world regions, has become something close to a default popular explanation for these questions in a way that represents a genuine and significant shift away from the explicitly or implicitly racist explanations that dominated popular and even much academic thinking on this subject for centuries before Diamond's book arrived. On the academic side, the book's reception has been considerably more mixed and contested, as the preceding sections of this video have detailed at length. Many historians, anthropologists, and archaeologists working directly in the specific fields and regions the book discusses have offered substantial, well-documented criticisms of specific empirical claims, of the book's tendency toward what they characterize as excessive environmental determinism, and of its relatively limited engagement with the internal complexity and agency of the non-Eurasian societies it discusses. Some scholars working in these fields have grown frustrated that a book they regard as containing serious substantive flaws continues to function as many members of the general public's primary or even sole source of information on these enormously complex historical questions, effectively crowding out more nuanced, more specialized and, in some cases, more recent scholarship that addresses these same questions with greater regional depth and methodological sophistication, even though that more specialized scholarship rarely achieves anything close to the same broad public readership that Diamond's book continues to enjoy. At the same time, it would be a mistake to read this academic contestation as amounting to a wholesale rejection of the book within scholarly circles. Many economists, political scientists, and even some historians and archaeologists continue to regard the book's broad central thesis that deep geographic and environmental factors played a major causal role in shaping long-run patterns of global development as a genuinely important and largely well-supported contribution, even while disagreeing substantially with specific details of how Diamond develops and presents that thesis. The quantitative research discussed in section 16, demonstrating statistically significant relationships between pre-modern geographic and agricultural advantages and modern economic outcomes, suggests that something importantly correct survives within Diamond's broader framework, even after accounting for the legitimate criticisms raised against its specific details and its treatment of subsequent historical contingency. Perhaps the most significant and durable legacy of the book, regardless of where any individual reader or scholar eventually lands on its specific empirical and conceptual merits, is the way it permanently shifted the baseline terms of the broader public conversation about global inequality and historical development. Before the book's publication, a meaningful portion of popular discourse on why some societies developed more advanced technology and political organization than others still carried at least implicit assumptions about differential capability between peoples, assumptions that, however rarely stated in explicitly racial terms by the late 20th century, nonetheless continued to shape how many people intuitively understood global history. Diamond's book, through its sheer popularity, its rigorous scientific grounding, and its explicit, repeated, carefully argued rejection of any inherent capability difference between human populations, helped move the default popular framework for thinking about this question decisively away from those older capability-based assumptions and toward an environmental and geographic framework instead. even as serious scholars have continued to debate and refine exactly how much explanatory weight that environmental framework alone can bear. Whatever specific criticisms apply to its details, this shift in the baseline terms of popular conversation about one of history's most consequential and most historically misused questions represents a genuinely significant and lasting contribution. In the next section, we turn to gathering together the strongest version of the case in the book's favour before moving to our final assessment. Having spent considerable time walking through both the architecture of Diamond's argument and the substantial criticisms that have been raised against it, it's worth pausing to assemble in one place the strongest possible version of the case in the book's favour, because that case is genuinely substantial and deserves to be stated clearly, rather than left scattered across the preceding sections. The first and perhaps most important element of this case is simply the scientific and moral achievement of definitively undermining racist explanations for global inequality using rigorous, falsifiable, evidence-based reasoning, rather than simply moral assertion. Prior to Diamond's intervention, a meaningful portion of popular and even some academic discourse continued to lean, implicitly or explicitly, on assumptions about differential capability between peoples to explain why some societies developed more advanced technology than others. Diamond replaced this with a testable, evidence-grounded alternative explanation, rooted in the biology of plant and animal domestication, the geography of continental orientation, and the epidemiology of zoonotic disease, that any careful reader could verify and evaluate using the actual archaeological, genetic, and historical record, rather than simply taking on faith. The second element of this strongest case is the genuine explanatory power the framework demonstrates across an enormous range of specific historical cases. The puzzle of why Pizarro's tiny force could topple the massive Inca Empire, the puzzle of why Aboriginal Australians, despite tens of thousands of years of habitation, never developed agriculture independently, the puzzle of why China's substantial early technological lead eventually gave way to European dominance, the puzzle of why closely related Polynesian populations diverged so dramatically in social complexity depending on which specific island they settled. All of these genuinely difficult, previously poorly explained historical puzzles receive a coherent, mutually reinforcing explanation under Diamond's framework. An explanatory unification across such a wide range of specific cases that is genuinely rare and genuinely impressive in any single work of popular non-fiction, regardless of the specific empirical details that subsequent research has since refined. The third element of this case is the book's enduring methodological model for how to think about deep historical causation more broadly, distinguishing carefully between proximate causes, the specific immediate factors operating in any given historical episode, and ultimate causes, the deeper, more distant factors that explain why those proximate causes existed and operated the way they did in the first place. This proximate versus ultimate causation framework has proven genuinely useful, well beyond the specific historical questions Diamond applies it to, offering a durable conceptual tool that subsequent researchers across multiple disciplines have continued to find valuable when thinking through complex, multi-causal historical and social phenomena more broadly. The fourth and final element of this strongest case is something more difficult to quantify, but genuinely significant nonetheless. The sheer intellectual seriousness and humility with which Diamond approaches an enormously sensitive and historically fraught subject. Rather than offering glib, simplistic answers in either direction, either an uncritical celebration of European achievement or a flattening dismissal of non-European societies as passive historical victims, Diamond consistently insists on the equal underlying capability and creativity of all human populations, while taking the actual historical record of divergent technological and political developments seriously enough to attempt a genuine, evidence-based explanation for it, rather than simply avoiding the question entirely out of understandable discomfort with its historical misuse. This combination of moral seriousness and scientific rigour, even where specific details of the resulting argument have been challenged and revised, represents a genuinely admirable model for how to approach difficult historical questions honestly. In our final section, we bring together everything we've covered across this entire video into a closing synthesis. We have now walked through the entire architecture of one of the most ambitious and most consequential works of popular nonfiction published in the last 50 years, and it's worth gathering everything together into something coherent you can actually carry forward. We began with Yali's question on a New Guinean beach in 1972, a deceptively simple question about why some peoples had so much cargo and others had so little, a question that for most of history had been answered implicitly or explicitly with some version of racial or cultural superiority. We then walk through Diamond's actual answer, built across the chain running from the uneven global distribution of domesticable plants and the even more severely restricted distribution of domesticable large mammals, through the resulting differences in food surplus, population density, and occupational specialization, through the compounding effects of continental orientation and internal geographic connectivity on the spread of agriculture and technology, and through the brutal, largely invisible role that zoonotic disease played in deciding the outcome of contact between societies that had travelled different distances along this same developmental chain. We tested this framework against some of history's most dramatic and most puzzling specific cases: Pizarro's improbable conquest of the Inca Empire, the devastating impact of European contact on Aboriginal Australian populations despite their tens of thousands of years of sophisticated environmental adaptation, the natural experiment of Polynesian settlement producing dramatically different social outcomes from a single shared ancestral population, and the genuinely puzzling case of China's substantial early technological lead eventually giving way to European global dominance. We then turn to the substantial and serious criticisms this framework has faced. The charge of excessive geographic determinism that, critics argue, understates genuine human agency and cultural variation. The concern that the book's treatment of specific non-Eurasian societies, despite genuinely sympathetic intentions, doesn't always do full justice to the internal richness and complexity of those societies' own histories, the more technical archaeological and genetic challenges to some of the book's specific empirical claims that have emerged from nearly 3 decades of subsequent research, and the more nuanced picture that later quantitative economic research has painted, one in which deep geographic factors set an important initial trajectory, but specific contingent historically documented institutional choices made during the colonial era mattered enormously as well, in some cases significantly reshaping or even reversing the outcomes that geography alone would have predicted. We sat honestly with the difficult ethical question of how this geographic framework interacts with questions of moral responsibility for the actual violence and exploitation of the colonial era, recognizing Diamond's own careful distinction between explaining how a historical asymmetry of power became possible and morally evaluating the specific choices made once that asymmetry existed, a distinction worth actively maintaining, rather than letting the book's emphasis on deep impersonal causation drift into anything resembling an excuse for specific historical atrocities. And we assembled in the previous section the strongest version of the case in the book's favour: the genuine scientific and moral achievement of replacing racist pseudo-explanation with rigorous, falsifiable, evidence-based reasoning, the remarkable explanatory power the framework demonstrates across an unusually wide range of specific historical puzzles, and the durable methodological contribution of distinguishing proximate from ultimate historical causation. So what should you actually take away from all of this? I think the most honest answer is this: guns, germs, and steel is neither the complete final explanation for global history that some of its most enthusiastic popular readers have sometimes taken it to be, nor is it the fundamentally flawed or dismissible work that some of its harshest academic critics have characterized it as. It is a genuinely serious, genuinely rigorous, and in its core architecture genuinely persuasive attempt to answer one of the most historically consequential and most historically misused questions human beings have ever asked. An attempt that succeeds remarkably well at the broad, large-scale level it was designed to operate at, while leaving real, legitimate room for more specialized historians, anthropologists, archaeologists, and economists to fill in, complicate, and in some specific cases revise the finer details of the picture. Whatever. Your own view on geography, history, and the deep roots of global inequality, going into this video or coming out of it, understanding the actual structure of this particular argument, the evidence it marshals, the cases it explains well, and the legitimate questions that remain genuinely open even after Diamond's full case has been made, gives you a far more sophisticated foundation for thinking about one of history's biggest questions than either uncritical acceptance or reflexive dismissal ever could. Thank you for spending this time walking through one of the most influential books of the last several decades with me.